this is one of those things that, I, like most of us, right, as a child, I started with a worldwide stamp collection. And then where I deviate is, unlike most of us who ultimately picked areas of specialization or created a more finite definition to what it is that we wanted to focus on, I never had that epiphany. Right? I added several areas of specialization, and I have several topical collections as well as country collections and specific collections of stamps or postal history around various things that have interested me. But I never stopped being a worldwide collector. And to this day, I have several library card file catalogs in my home, and I file stamps by country by Scott number in glassine envelopes behind 3x5 cards. And it's some sort of an evidence of probably an obsessive compulsive disorder or something, but I'm a gleeful worldwide collector. And one of the things I did as I got deeper into some of the areas that I was specializing in, I recognized that when I went to the stamp shows, it was very difficult for me to find things that I needed to add to the specialized collections. And I wasn't really interested in carrying around a bunch of want lists and trying to figure out how to drive completeness in certain countries necessarily that I wasn't keenly interested in. So I needed to have something to do. And someone gave me a single specimen stamp album. And I took great joy in ownership of this item and used it as my excuse to engage in all sorts of conversations with dealers and collectors who I might not have otherwise engaged with. And that the goal of the whole thing was to collect one stamp from every entity that had issued stamps according to the author of this album. And it took an amazing amount of time, but ultimately completed that, and have kind of continued to redefine the quest and re-go after it, and still find it as one of the things that is one of the most fun things I do in the world of philately. So I kind of decided to start helping other people understand the opportunity, whether they choose to take interest in it or not. It's one of those fun things that you can kind of do almost as a sidebar to the rest of the hobby. So how do you do this, right? If you decide that you're going to take on this challenge, how do you do it? Why do you do it? What is it that you're doing, right? Those are some simple questions that I'll try to answer here first. So why, I've always been, and I think like a lot of philatelists, I've always been kind of interested in geography. I think there's a direct connection between some sort of global curiosity and stamps that we learn through building our collections, to the point where I can remember in college many years ago when trivia was so important. People loved to have me on their team when there was a geography category, because I knew crazy stuff that nobody else knew, that just because of the stamps. And it, like I said, it gave me something to look for at the shows, at the local club meetings, online, and it didn't cost a ton of money. And in fact, when I did the first quest for everywhere, I created a rule for myself that said I wasn't going to spend more than $10 on anything that I put into the collection. Now, I will admit that I broke the rule a couple of times, but very few times. It really wasn't that hard to do it. And I know, there have been people out there who collect number ones of the world, and there are people, you can kind of do this however you'd like. There are variants of this, and, whatever it is that brings you joy is probably, the right way to go at it. So what is it, right? What's the definition of everywhere? Like our hobby, you can make up your own rules, right? Isn't that, it's kind of this isn't, some sort of judged exhibit. This is something that you're doing for fun. So you can do it however you want. The album that I'll talk about in just a few minutes, it divided the world into active countries versus dead countries. And then you can have a whole conversation about all the provisional occupational stamps, all the stamps that have been issued by government or quasi-governmental agencies and international organizations. The Swiss, for example, are very good at supporting international organizations and cranking out a lot of stamps. And then, kind of once you decide what counts as everywhere, then how do you actually you create your guideposts, but then you actually need the list, right? You need the actual detailed list of what it is that you're going after. And how do you do that? Well, again, you can kind of make your own rules, and it's been interesting in the feedback I've gotten from people since the journal came out. There have been several people that have sent me emails in appreciation of the article and telling me the story of how they've chosen to go after this and what their criteria were. And it's been absolutely fascinating to see these emails. But what I did, I tend to use Scott catalogs. Other than, in addition to Scott catalogs, I use Gibbons for some of the West Indies stuff. But in general, for worldwide, I use Scott catalogs. So inclusion in the Scott catalog was a good indicator for me that they should be on the list. If you go to the APS stamp store, you can search by country in the stamp store. There's a drop-down list. I actually scanned through that drop-down list to see what entities they were recognizing as stamp issuing to be included in stamp store. The album that I used for the active countries, they had a requirement that you needed to be part of the UPU, the Universal Postal Union. So, you could look at, current and former members of the UPU. And then there are some wonderful books out there that have been around for a while, right? The Stamp Atlas, which is, just a general kind of a mix of geography and philately in a single book, or even the Lin's site, right? The zillions of stamps and stuff. And then, of course, there's Wikipedia. You can go out on the internet and say, give me a list of all the dead countries. And there are a whole bunch of websites that'll come up, and they'll all have different answers as to what all the dead countries are. So I put together my list. I did it when I did it for covers, which I'm still working on and is a task that will never end. I put it into a spreadsheet and printed out labels for like the cover album. So, but in the case of a published album, of course, it's done for you. What else do you need to think about, right? As you're kind of creating these guide rails, do you care mint or used stamps? If you're doing covers, do you care if they're postal covers or if they're philatelically inspired? Do they have to be commercial? How much are you willing to spend, right? You can be as elaborate or as frugal with this as you probably want to. And how will you have people help you, right? A want list takes a different form here, right? A want list is a list of countries where once you get one, you take the country off the list, right? So it's really just a list of here are the places that I'm still looking for, so that when you're sifting through stuff, you know what you have and what you don't have, because all things considered, there are several hundred items that probably wind up on the list, and trying to do it from memory can be a challenge. So as you accumulate this, what do you do with it? Well, several of the people that I've met that have done a similar exercise use homemade albums. I was a gentleman from New Zealand that reached out to me actually earlier this week after the APS article came out. And he was talking about how he did it. And he had a page per country. And then on each country, he had a stamp of each different type that he could find for that country. So he would have a regular postal stamp. He would have a postage due stamp, a semi-postal, an airmail, a revenue, what have you. And I'm like, wow, that's ambitious, right? A stamp, of each type from each country per page with a little bit of information about that country. There are the out-of-print album, which we'll talk about in a second, still exists. Occasionally they come up for sale, but that's probably maybe the most difficult thing to do if you were trying to find the Stamp Gazetter album we're going to talk about. On the other hand, the Smithsonian album that they put out is still available on the APS website. And it does it by geography rather than some sort of alphabetical list by country. They do it by geography, and we'll talk about that in a little more detail. The only thing weird about that one is it prints out sideways. So it's a 8.5 by 11 landscape page. So it's a little odd to find the right 3-wing binders and stuff to put the pages in, or, something creative, right? Whatever it is that, if you have a method by which you store and maintain your collections today, there's no reason why you can't leverage whatever method you're comfortable with stock pages, what have you. So, and then where do you find the stamps, right? So for me, the initial excuse in the pre-pandemic world was, here's something for me to look at stamp shows. But then ultimately to fill in some of the holes for the more obscure material, I had to get a little more creative, right? So leveraging the internet. I mentioned eBay here, but any of the online sales sites, the the APS stamp store, the zillions of stamp site from Lynn's, et cetera, online dealers. Um, and a shameless plug for the International Society of Worldwide Stamp Collectors that I'm the president of, we have wonderful sales and swap circuits as well. And I've pulled a surprising number of items out of the swap circuits that therefore actually cost me nothing. And a couple of good worldwide dealers, once they kind of caught wind of what I was up to, there was a gentleman in Scotland, for example, who went on his own quest to help me get some of the items off my list. So, be creative, leverage your network. And if you're not embarrassed by the fact that you're doing this because it's not terribly serious, people take joy in helping you plug the holes and finding, knowing what you're looking for as they're looking through stuff. People, hey, I found a stamp from wherever. Do you need it? Okay, yeah. Or no, maybe I don't. But, people are happy to help. So that was nice. This is the original album I used, right? This was Terra Nova Publishing back in, God, I think the 80s probably put this out. And this is the introduction, right? So it's a single specimen divided into two parts, active countries and dead countries. This is what a page looks like. I just took a picture of a page at random. This happens to be in the middle of the M's, as you can see, where there's information about each country, a map of where it is in the world, and then a space to mount the stamp that you've found to put into your collection. So visualize this times, 300 countries, and you've got kind of what's going on here. And then for the dead countries, because the country is a dead country, rather than including the map, they simply included the instructions, the description, and then a space to mount the stamp. Now, I didn't have a lot of rules about what stamp would qualify. I looked for something that was a legitimate postage stamp, but I suspect, like this Las Bellas stamp, for example, that's on this, that's probably a forgery based on what I paid for it. And I'm not an expert in that area, but if you were to look through this, it was more about the fun of finding the piece of material to stick in here and less about a serious examination necessarily of the individual items. Some of these, like at the brief moment in time where Kenya, Uganda, Tanganyika, and Zanzibar were in, they only put out a couple of stamps. Literally, in this case, I think if I'm reading the text, 2. So some of them are a little more obscure than others, and kind of all part of the fun. This is the Smithsonian catalog. This is the one that's available on the website from the APS. There is the URL for where you can find it, but if you just go to stamps.org, you'll have no problem tracking it down with a little creative searching if you don't write down the link. And this was inspired. Bill Gross made a spectacular financial and philatelic donation to the National Postal Museum. And if you're ever anywhere near Washington, D.C., I highly recommend investing a day to go visit the facility and take a look at the stamps that are on display. And at one point, they were showing a broader assortment of his material. And in support of that exhibit, they put together this album. And when I first, I downloaded, I think back then, whenever that was, and in the early part of the 2000s, 2003 or something like that. And like many things, it was no longer available on the Smithsonian site. So I was worried that it was gone. And then as I was talking to the folks at APS about the article, they're like, oh no, we have it on our website. And they did. But we laughed because they were Googling it to try to find it too, only to realize that they had it on their own website. Like I said, this is the one, if you print this out, and this image has probably been modified slightly to fit on this slide. This is landscape, and you're going to have to drill the holes if you're going to put it in a 3-ring binder over on the left side of this page, and it'll still work. There's enough space between the left edge of the page and the beginning of the display area so that there's enough room to mount this in a binder and have it still work, even though you see the top lines of the region going all the way to the margin. But that's what I've done. I printed it out on plain, well, kind of a slightly heavier stock, but I printed it out on plain 8.5 by 11 paper. Then I went to Amazon and bought the landscape 3-ring binders because I couldn't find them in my local office supply store. And then I took the pages to my local FedEx office and they punched the holes. So they just drilled the holes. So that's how I went through that. I suspect the adventure will be a little different for each of you, but I couldn't find pre-punched paper landscape. So I printed it on plain paper and then got it drilled. And then this is this was probably the silliest quest I ever started, which was to do the same thing for covers. I thought the stamps were hard, and then I started to do it with covers. I suspect there are some entities that have issued stamps from which there are no known covers, or no known covers that cost less than I would pay for a mortgage on my home. So, but it gave me something else to do. In this case, I bought several binders from Subway Stamp Shop that were sold with these pages. And like I said, I created my list, printed it out on the Avery labels that you see there in the lower left of each page. And this is to do all of the countries, and each page is double-sided, so each page will hold 4 countries. It's still, I think, 6 binders just to start with, to hold all of the pages, even when they were all empty, with a small enough number of pages in each binder so that when you put the covers in, it doesn't overflow. And I just pulled one example out here and show you here as an example. But like I said, this one, I think that may be impossible.